Coming up on Maine Challenge, Sara Gideon, candidate for the Democratic nomination for the United States Senate. Hello and welcome to Maine Challenge. Each week, we take a dive into Maine's critical issues like the election, social justice, healthcare, and more. Today, our guest is Sara Gideon, a candidate for the Democratic nomination to the U.S. Senate. Welcome, Sara.
Hi, Chuck. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you. It's sort of a distraction because I feel like giggling. Sara, for the audience, the thousands of people in our studio audience, Sara and I were seatmates in the front row of the Maine House of Representatives for 2 years, and there's obviously some lingering silliness, which we're just going to have to get past.
Absolutely.
Thanks again for coming and for being a part of this. We're really glad to have you here, and I know you have a very interesting race, and it appears that you're doing very well. My first question, I guess, is about the election. Were you in agreement with the postponement of the primary from a June date to Tuesday, July 14th?
So first of all, good morning, Chuck, and thank you so much for having me also. So let's dive right into your question. You know, the most important things for me are twofold, really. Number one, making sure that people are able to stay safe and healthy in terms of this primary vote, but also making sure that everybody has the ability to exercise their right to vote. And I think that moving the primary from June to July gives us a better chance to accomplish both of those goals at the same time.
I have a question about ranked choice voting. Is ranked choice voting going to apply in the primary?
Yes, ranked choice voting applies in both the primary and the general election in this race.
Okay, because there are a number of candidates, 3 on the Democratic primary, and so that's obviously an interesting point. And also in the general, I'm glad to know that for a fact. Yeah. Do you plan to participate in forums and debates with the other candidates?
Yes, so we anticipate that there will be a couple of hopefully televised forums and debates where people statewide are able to watch us. And I know my team is currently having conversations with a number of groups about exactly that.
Great. There have been a number of organizations that are very interested in this race and supporting Lincoln County Indivisible, which is the producer of this show. And I know everyone is interested in how this race is going. So it's really, we're lucky that we have you here. Putting on your Madam Speaker cap for just a moment, as the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, do you anticipate that there will be a special session?
Well, yeah, so interesting that you said putting on my speaker's hat for a moment. You know, it is interesting both holding one elected office and running for a different one at the same time. And one thing that I have found during coronavirus and this pandemic is that those two hats in many ways become one, because it's really about reaching out to people and helping people and connecting them to resources, which leads me into your question about special sessions. So first, I think what I want to start with is that in the legislature, we did adjourn earlier than we normally would have. And that was because we looked around at these 186 people from every part of the state and realized that not only the joining of these people together in 2 rooms, but also all of the staff and the public who come to these buildings also, were really in danger of becoming super spreaders. So we worked hard and very, very swiftly to bring together packages of bipartisan legislation to help people in Maine deal with coronavirus. And then we did adjourn. Now, we are asking ourselves the question every day of what work do we need to make sure that we are able to complete, and also what's happening for people in the state right now. And is there a way that we can participate and help the administration in this way? So we're currently thinking about those things. Next week, we are still determining the exact day. The Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee, lovingly known as AFA, will begin meeting on a regular basis so that they can gather all of the information for the legislative branch about what is happening, both in terms of state revenues and expenditures, but also really getting a better sense of what the needs of Mainers are out there. And we anticipate that that might be followed by other committees of jurisdiction around certain issues as well. And in the meantime, the question of whether the legislature itself comes in for a special session is an ongoing question, and one that we're just monitoring closely.
So it hasn't been decided, but it seemed to me in following the legislature as I do, that there were a lot of unfinished pieces of business, and the legislature is not set up to adjourn the way you had to this year. And so there must be a bunch of bills still in committee that need to be reported out and disposed of in both chambers. So I was thinking it would be logical that you would have one, but I also think about the complication of doing what we've always done. I mean, no one has seen anything like what we're dealing with right now. So that puts a lot of challenge on you while you're running a campaign for federal office to be also minding the store in a very big sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, first and foremost, and this is where I said that it's really one hat, my job is to be thinking about what is happening in the lives of Mainers, making sure that my team, both teams, are constantly reaching out to people and hearing what's happening and connecting people to resources, or thinking about how we lift issues up to the administration and to Governor Mills, and or how we can also support and make a difference on those issues in the legislative body as well. But as you pointed out, Chuck, it is and was an unusual way to adjourn, but it is, of course, an unprecedented time. And the most important thing, no matter who we are or whether we hold an elected office or not, is looking out at the people around us and seeing where needs are and how we come together to address them. Because one thing is for sure is that there is only one way that we will make it through this pandemic and then emerge on the other side and really rebuild what life needs to look like for people. And that is if we are working together to do it.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that spirit, certainly, very much. Looking at your campaign now, you must find it very frustrating, and I certainly, just as a viewer, but also an interested observer, the advertising is very disturbing to me as a longtime viewer and political junkie. I just find some of these advertisements deceptive and misleading. And I'm especially offended, and I would be happy to say this face-to-face with Senator Collins and her staff, but the idea, and maybe I have an insider's view of the budget process as a former legislator, but the idea that they would say Gideon's budget raises tax, I mean, that is so personally offensive to me that they would try to paint you that way, that I want to see you come out with a knife. I mean, it's just, and I know you won't, that's not your style, but would you say something about how you feel about these ads? I mean, your ads are not nearly as vicious, and there are some PAC ads that you didn't create, that your campaign, that aren't from your campaign, that are on your behalf, that are negative against Senator Collins. She's not the only one doing this, but hers are really vicious and misleading, and it disturbs me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So, Chuck, you bring up a good point in a couple of ways that I want to touch on. The first is just the whole concept of dark money out there, and the fact that there is a tremendous amount of attention on this U.S. Senate race in Maine, because for people who don't know, who might be watching, this Senate race in Maine really could determine who is in control of the United States Senate. And so that's a really challenging place for us to be as Mainers, because it means there's a lot of outside attempts to influence, and that's dark money. Those are the PACs who come in and run ads against both sides. And I want to point out that the reason why those ads are able to run in the way they do without disclosures is because Susan Collins herself was the deciding vote against this bill called the Disclosure Act in the US Senate. So that is something that we need to change, and it's actually one of the things on the very top of my list that I want to do in the US Senate, making sure that people as individuals have a greater voice than special interests, a greater voice than corporations, and that means passing something like the Disclose Act and overturning Citizens United as well. But in terms of these ads that you're talking about specifically, and the fact that Senator Collins is running negative ads against me, well, a month and a half before even the primary is coming, I think says a couple of things. Number one, I think that the Collins campaign is very, very worried about this race in a way that they really have not had to be any time in the past almost 4 years. Now, the other thing that's going on here, though, which I unfortunately think that we need to be getting used to, is that the Republican Party and the GOP are going to continue to come after the front runner in this campaign and against Senator Collins. And we've seen it for months in the past, and we are seeing them really step that up now with new ads almost on a weekly basis that are purely negative ads.
It's a tough time to be interested in politics. I find myself often wanting to just turn off the TV and close the windows and not pay any attention, but what's going on is so important. I have another observation that I would like your opinion on.
Sure.
It seems to me that these demonstrations that have been going on, fortunately, Maine has not seen any with the AR-15s and camo wearing clowns, but they seem to be very partisan. We've only seen those in states with Democratic governors. And I'm wondering if you have an observation on that, or is that just my outside opinion?
Well, here's my observation, Chuck. I think that, we often talk about the idea that examples are set from the top down and from our leaders. And I think that this is one example that we see being set really from the level of President Trump. He has long used his cell phone and Twitter account to announce policies or incite people to do things. And that's exactly what he's done around this pandemic as well. Sending out tweets, really encouraging people in certain states to rise up against their governor. The thing about this is, and this is important that we continue to talk about here in Maine and across every state in this country, is that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and figuring out how we both make sure that we are literally protecting people's lives, but also understanding the real financial devastation that is happening for people and how scary that is and how long lasting that can be. The only way that we are able to deal with those things simultaneously and to find our best way through them is if, in fact, we are working together, not fighting against each other. And that's why, as important as it is to point out the lack of leadership on the federal level that we have had so far from this president, and unfortunately from the United States Senate with Mitch McConnell in control of it, it is also equally important to point out the things that we need to do and the fact that it is never too late to come together and to do them. And that includes things like making sure that we're continuing to pass literal relief on to states, to municipalities, that we are literally thinking about how we help and save our small businesses who employ, especially in a state like Maine, so many individuals and whose families rely on those jobs and those paychecks. It's why we have to have a coordinating manufacturing of testing and of personal protective equipment and a coordination of a supply chain that makes sure that every single state is able to access those in the way that we need. So, yes, let's recognize where the problems are coming from, but let's also continue to encourage people to do the right thing because all of our lives depend on it.
Well, thank you. That's a little bit of a ray of hope. I want to pivot a little bit to January, when you very well may be Senator Gideon, sworn into the United States Senate. You'll be facing a huge budget shortfall after all these stimulus bills that have passed and the money that's been spent. But also you're faced with, I think, some really serious healthcare challenges for all of your constituents. And I've looked on your website and I've seen your support of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. But I'm wondering, in this current situation with 36 million people unemployed and many of them losing all their health insurance, is that going to be enough? And maybe you could give us a little thought about Medicare for all, universal health care, single payer, whatever the term becomes, where you would be on healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so many big questions in there, but really the most important questions, because these are the questions about really how we survive as human beings and how we do well. And I want to start with the premise that I really believe that healthcare is a basic human right. I was brought up in a family with my dad as a pediatrician, my mother in behavioral and mental health, and they demonstrated to me what it means to care for somebody else and how important access is for everybody. Now, look, even before COVID-19 hit, we knew that we had a real problem with healthcare in this country. The cost of healthcare is far too high, and also access to healthcare, especially in a rural state like Maine, can be very, very challenging. Our rural hospitals, already too far and few between, are always in danger of closing and living on incredibly tight margins every single month. So when we think about what has happened with COVID-19, with so many people losing their jobs and then also losing their healthcare associated with their jobs, I believe that the path and the ideas that I was thinking about before COVID-19 are still the right ones, but that what we are going to have to focus on is how to make them affordable for everyone. So first, let me say that I think that Medicare is a program that is a fantastic model and that we should allow for everybody who wants to buy Medicare to be able to buy into that program. But that's not quite enough, because we have to also make sure that it is affordable. And I think that means including putting in caps on costs within Medicare for people, but also thinking about, in similar ways to how we built the exchange under the ACA, that we think about additional subsidies for people based on their income levels. And I think that's what we need to do. Now, you mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and I can't let a mention of the Affordable Care Act pass without talking about why the Affordable Care Act is so important right now. And the fact that it is in extreme jeopardy, again, because of a deciding vote from Senator Susan Collins on the 2017 tax bill. And that vote meant that the Affordable Care Act now became vulnerable. just last week, the Supreme Court began receiving their briefings in Texas versus United States. And for people who are not aware of that court case, that is the Trump and Republican lawmakers' case to completely overturn the ACA. Why is that important? Because whether we are people with pre-existing conditions, which are most people, whether we are parents or grandparents hoping and worrying about our kids, especially these kids who are graduating now, where the job market is decimated and we want to know that they can stay on our health insurance until they're 26, whether we're seniors and we want to make sure that we are not being charged more just because of our age, the Affordable Care Act and the core provisions in the Care Act are incredibly important to every single one of us as Americans, and we have got to preserve and protect that no matter what things look like going forward. The other thing I just want to touch on, which is a little bit outside of what you were talking about in a sense, because you asked directly about healthcare, Chuck, but is going back to that 2017 tax bill overall. And the fact that nearly $2 trillion in tax breaks were given primarily to corporations in this country and to the wealthiest people in this country. Who don't need it. And also, they're not the people here in Maine, they're not the people that, you know, you represented when you were in the state legislature, or that I did, or that I hope to as a United States Senator. And we saw an extension of that slipped right into that CARES Act as well, another benefit going to that 1%. At a time when we are facing a pandemic, at a time when people are losing their jobs, and literally we have unprecedented numbers of unemployment and people whose jobs are maybe never going to come back again. So we need to look long and hard at that, and we need to make changes and take that money and instead invest it in ourselves and think in a very smart and bold and forward-looking way as we come out of this pandemic about the roles that we can play in using that money in getting people back to work.
Thank you. When we get warmed up solving this plague, we're going to face a climate crisis, which we already should be facing and may not be doing enough. Any thoughts on how Senator Gideon will work toward that?
Yes. First of all, I'm so glad, Chuck, that you called it what it is, a climate crisis. Too often we refer to it as climate change, and that doesn't begin to describe what is upon us. You know, during this pandemic, I, and probably you and so many others, have had this thought of, we looked for years ahead and saw that a pandemic was likely coming, and we had the opportunity to be prepared, but we were not. And I think about the similarities between that, the knowledge of something that exists and how bad it can become, and the fact that we can be prepared for it. And I think about the similarities between the pandemic and climate crisis in that way, and think maybe this will be our opportunity to acknowledge that we have got to take bold and immediate action. I often use the words, these exact words, that I will charge into the US Senate with the belief that bold and immediate action on climate change is an absolute necessity. And I think it starts with recognizing that our entire economy and really our infrastructure in this country was built on fossil fuels, and that it is going to take a tremendous amount of change to turn what is now a crisis for us instead into an opportunity. We need to think about how we overhaul some of our infrastructure systems. That includes our energy grids. It includes our transportation system. We need to think about how, in doing that, we can build clean energy jobs. Yes, that are in the short term in terms of, for example, building renewable energy projects, or thinking about how we both build new housing that is net zero, or continue to transition our old housing. But it's also an opportunity in a different way, because as we know here in Maine personally, but across this country, we have really seen a loss of manufacturing jobs. And at the same time as we have done things in Maine and in some other states, like set aggressive goals to increase our renewable energy production, we could be doing that in a way that we also put ourselves on the cutting edge of innovation and technology and start to build the ability to manufacture the components involved in that renewable energy right here in our state in Maine or in our country in general. And instead, what we've seen over these past decades is that we have largely ceded that to China, to Germany, and to other countries. So there's such opportunity here at the same time that we fight climate change. And just a couple of other things that I want to say in that, number one, this country needs to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord absolutely as step number one with the new United States Congress and a new United States president. But we also need to go even further than that in setting the most ambitious goals that we can to reduce dirty carbon emissions and increase renewable energy generation. And we can use Maine, in fact, as a model for that.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate your use of the word opportunity in discussion of a crisis, because a very wise person said to me once, every crisis thoughtfully approached is an opportunity. And that's what we need leaders to understand and take us in that direction. So I really appreciate your thought of seeing it as opportunity as well as a huge challenge. And it's really multiple challenges. One more thing, we're running out of time. It hasn't taken very long at all to run out of time. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on budgeting and rescuing Social Security in the new budget realities. I mean, it's just stunning to me that we are looking at enormous budget shortfalls in the next year, and how our leaders are going to face that. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of these programs are programs that we as Americans, but especially we as Mainers, being demographically the oldest state in the nation, rely on very, very heavily. And if you remember going back pre-COVID-19 to January, February, we had this president talking about making major cuts to these programs, the exact opposite direction that we need to go in fact, because number one, we need to recognize that our aging populations or populations of people who have disabilities and who rely on both Social Security and Medicare for those reasons still need those programs. In fact, we have to also recognize that they are getting close to insolvency. And so instead of thinking about how we cut back on them, we need to do exactly the opposite and think about how we strengthen them. I think that there are a number of ways in which we do that, and they probably need to be explored in the context of the changes that coronavirus and this pandemic has wreaked on all of us, because previous proposals have focused on, for example, some uses of taxes. And I think in order to really answer that question in its modern context, we need to understand the full extent of how coronavirus has impacted our economy and jobs, and then think about it. And I'm pretty sure I can't answer that question, honestly and well on this day because of that.
Well, thank you so much for participating. We're all out of time, but I really appreciate your taking the time to join us, and I hope you will again. I wish you all the best in the upcoming primary, and let's stay in touch. And I just thank you very much for taking part, and good luck in the campaign.
Thank you so much, Chuck. It's wonderful to see you.
Please join us again next week on Maine Challenge, a production of Lincoln County Indivisible and Lincoln County TV.
Show your support for Maine Challenge and LCTV's programming. We're all about community. please go to lctv.org to make a contribution. Your support makes us stronger together.